Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Swan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in the field of South African tax. And I try to do it in the time that you would have available if you want to enjoy a quick cup of coffee. Our topic for today is tax resident status. And it's something that my perception is that many advisors and taxpayers believe it is an election that you can make. So often the question that I get is, when can or should I make this election to no longer be a tax resident? The bad news that I've got for you is that it is not an election. Your tax resident status actually depends on the definition of a resident and whether you satisfy that or not. And this in turn is a question of your facts and circumstances. When we look at this definition then, the definition has got two components. Firstly, a person is considered to be a South African tax resident if they are ordinarily resident in South Africa. And then there's also another component where a person can be considered a resident based on their physical presence in South Africa, so the physical presence test. If we look at ordinary residence, what does it really mean? So essentially, it's a question of whether South Africa is your real home or not. And this depends on your facts and circumstances. So, for example, do you live here? If you do, this is your place of ordinary residence. If you are absent because you've permanently moved abroad, or are you just temporarily absent for whatever reason? So there's quite a bit of case law on this, but what's very clear from this case law is that it's not an election, something that you can elect to remain a resident once you've moved away, or vice versa, to say that you can elect to no longer be a resident while you still stay in South Africa. Also important and related to this not being an election is the fact that there are tax consequences to ceasing to be a resident. And you can't elect to postpone or elect out of these tax consequences. So for example, if you cease to be a resident, you've got a deemed disposal of your assets at their market value, and often this results in capital gains tax being payable. And this is not something you can choose or avoid by choosing to remain a resident. The second element, the physical presence test. So this is aimed at persons who do not ordinarily reside in South Africa, but they are sufficiently present over a 6-year period for the law to consider them to be tax residents in South Africa. And this is aimed at foreign persons primarily, so persons who do not live in South Africa. Both of these requirements and the whole definition of a resident is subject to treaty override. So what the definition also states that if a person is considered to be exclusively resident of another jurisdiction in terms of a double tax agreement, then that person is not considered to be a tax resident of South Africa. So where these double tax agreements fit in, if a person is considered to be a resident under the domestic laws of both jurisdictions, the double tax agreement has got what they call a tiebreaker clause. And these tiebreaker clauses would then look at a number of factors to consider where the person is deemed to be exclusively resident for tax residence purposes. So these tiebreakers include looking at where you've got a permanent home available, where your center of vital interest is, where the person has got a habitual abode, but all these factors really favor the jurisdiction where the person lives. So I think in a lot of cases, you should get a fairly similar outcome under the ordinary residence assessment than you would, for example, if you look at a person's center of vital interest. Now, where I suspect the idea that you've got an election to be a resident or not comes from is that you need to declare your change in residence status on e-filing. Now, this is really an administrative process that the law doesn't describe or prescribe when it must be done. What the Tax Administration Act, however, requires is that you need to complete your tax returns accurately. So if you your resident status changed, you are no longer a South African resident, then to file accurate tax returns, you need to declare this change in your resident status to SARS. It may also be that if that the person would wish to declare this as soon as possible, seeing that once you are no longer a resident, you are only taxable on your South African sourced income. So if you no longer reside in South Africa, you work abroad, then the income that you earn there wouldn't be subject to tax in South Africa. But if you don't inform SARS about the change in your resident status, then of course it would just be fair for them to keep on treating you and trying to tax you as if you are a resident until you've notified them otherwise. So in closing, the important point from today, tax residence is not an election or a choice. Second important point is your tax resident status depends on your facts and circumstances. It also depends on the definition of a resident, in some cases on double tax agreement provisions. And for those double tax agreement provisions to apply or not, you may also have to look at the residence provisions of other jurisdictions to see whether there's a dual residence conflict, and you need to look at the tiebreaker clause of the DTA. That's all for this episode. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please tell all your friends and colleagues about it and go and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. If you've got any questions that you would like me to discuss in a future episode, my email address is in the show notes below the episode. You are welcome to send me an email. I would gladly listen to your suggestions and try to build an episode around what you would like to hear. As always, nothing in this podcast should be construed as tax advice or a substitute for fact-specific tax advice. Until next time, goodbye.